So thank you very much for coming, everybody, this afternoon. This session is looking at women's leadership. And I'm not going to make a comment about how usual it is that women's leadership gets pushed, but that's another story. I'm afraid we do have to finish at 4, so I'm really very pleased that we've got such a high calibre group of people on this panel this afternoon. How we're going to do it is, let me introduce my panel first, which is Laura Liswood at the Fund, who's the General Secretary of the Council of Women World Leaders and also founder of the White House Project. Liv Garfield, who's the Chief Executive of Severn Trent Water and is also one of the youngest female leaders of a FTSE 100 company. And Elizabeth Philippouli, who's founder... Did I pronounce that correctly?
Oh, absolutely.
Perfect.
Impressive.
Elizabeth Philippouli, founder and chief executive of the Global Thinkers Forum. So quite a collection. And my name is Christine Allen, and I am the Director of Policy and Public Affairs for Christian Aid, which is an international NGO that works on a number of different ranges of work with people of all faiths and none. But gender justice is one of our key planks. So how we're going to do is we're going to ask Laura to give us a kind of keynote, as it were, and then I'm going to ask Liv and Elizabeth to make a few reactions. Then I'm going to throw it out to you. I don't think there's a roving mic, so I need to ask you to speak up to what particular key issues have struck you so far and the things that you want to discuss a bit more, and then we'll have a bit more of a conversation from our panellists. So without further ado...
Well, it's a real honor and privilege to be here today, so thank you very much for that. And as I was listening to the General, a great admirer of his and his work, and I would, of course, never disagree with him, but he did indicate that the child's brain is impulsive, doesn't know right from wrong, and doesn't understand risk. But unfortunately, as we saw last week, that's not limited to the child's mind. if you get my drift. Right. So let me tell you a little bit about my own journey and what I've learned about women's leadership. My own particular journey started with what I call one of those in-the-shower questions, which we all have, which probably should generally stay in the shower. But this was what would it be like if we had a woman president in the United States? Now, this wasn't an arbitrary question at the time, because I had read some research from something called the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University that had done some research on women state legislators in our states. And there was enough women state legislators to do an analytical research on it, quantitative research. And they found that women state legislators actually did legislate differently than men. They interacted differently with their constituents. They handled committees differently. They introduced different bills, regardless of party. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. So what might it be like if we had a woman president? What might we see? Now, this was a while ago, and right before Beijing. So I thought, well, perhaps I could meet one world leader, one woman president or prime minister, and ask her these questions. I had no idea why I could meet a woman president or prime minister. I am not from CNN. But I did go about asking for interviews, and it turned out there were at the time 15 women living who had been or were then president or prime minister of their country. And I went about asking for these interviews with the world leaders and sort of cut to the chase. After 18 months, I'd met all 15 of the world leaders. Not one of the world leaders turned me down for an interview. Margaret Thatcher did say, "Come back after you've met everyone else." I'm pretty sure she didn't think I was coming back. She was also the only one who required I bring a makeup person. And someone said, "For you or for her?" It was, in fact, for her. She did display whether one agreed with her politics, and I understand that. One of the traits of leadership, she was enormously curious. So my interview, which was scheduled for, and since he was the last one, my interview, which was scheduled for a half an hour, went about 3.5 hours with her, because she was very curious as to what the other leaders had to say. It did take about an hour to get through the Falklands, but, as she was talking about it. But each of the leaders that I spoke with were very curious as to what the other leaders had to say. In fact, my interviews were getting longer and longer and longer. would be kind of odd after a while. A president would tell me a problem she had, and I'd say, "Oh, President so-and-so, don't worry. President so-and-so had the exact same problem." So it was a little bit of therapy as I was going along. But I did finally ask them if they wanted to meet each other. They said they did. We had a summit in Stockholm where most of the leaders, women leaders, came. It was chaired by Mary Robinson of Ireland. And they created a council of themselves and asked me to be the Secretary General of it. And so the council started out with, at the time, 10 of the women at that time joined the council. And today there are 62 women who are members of the council. And so if any of you are freely elected head of state or head of government, we will gladly invite you to join the council. We'll wait about 3 months to make sure you stick. They don't all stick. But when we were doing this work with creating the Secretariat, we put it at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And I was reminded every day as to why I was doing this work, because I would walk by a granite slab that had a quote from President John F. Kennedy on it. And the quote said, "When at some future date, the High Court of History sits in judgment on each one of us, our success or failure in whatever office we hold will be measured by the answers to 4 questions. Were we truly men of courage? Were we truly men of integrity? Were we truly men of dedication? Were we truly men of judgment?" And I'd read that every day, and I would think to myself, such good questions to ask men. But of course, they're terribly good questions to ask women, too. But of course, in history, we have seen, generally speaking, that men have been the leaders that we've defined as leaders. In fact, we have basically what one could call an archetype of what a leader looks like. And one of the reasons I know that's interesting work from Malcolm Gladwell in his book, Blink, where he talks about the fact that within the United States, 16% of men in the United States are 6 feet or taller, 154 centimeters approximately. 16% of men. 57% of Fortune 500 male CEOs are 6 feet or taller, which is 4 times the cohort. Now, I've actually done a lot of research on this, and I've yet to read any research that correlates leadership ability and skeletal structure. But now you're looking at 4 times the cohort. So something has to be going on. Basically, what's going on is we have an archetype of what a leader looks like. We have an archetype. But how do archetypes work? I don't know. You're 6 feet or taller. You walk into the room. Everyone goes, "Leader." Until you open your mouth and start talking. And then everyone goes, "No, not leader." No. You're 5'9" or shorter, whatever. You walk into the room. Nobody says leader until you prove it. That's the difference. By and large, dominant groups are assumed to be competent until they show they're incompetent. Non-dominant groups, women, others, are assumed to be incompetent until they prove they're competent. 2 totally different things. 2 totally different things. So that's one of the challenges, I think, that women leaders have. As I was listening to these leaders and learning from them, they really shared with me many of their experiences. Every one of the world leaders, every one of them, expressed the fact that they were over-scrutinized. They were over-scrutinized by the press. They were over-scrutinized by the voter. The tolerance for mistakes for them was less than the tolerance for mistakes for men. That they couldn't get away with some of the things that the men were getting away with. Again, we've seen that recently. They brought different people. They thought that they brought different people to the table than their male counterparts did, often because they came from a different part of society than their male counterparts did. Now, let me be clear. I do not think that all women represent truth, beauty, and light. They don't. They don't. We've had mediocre male leaders, and we've had mediocre female leaders, right? But they're entitled to be mediocre, just like the men are entitled to be mediocre. We've had heroic men leaders, and we've had heroic women leaders. Yeah. But I just want to be clear that I don't think that every woman possesses all of these sort of beneficent traits that we say that women may possess. Do women have a tendency to have dialogue, to have a tendency to avoid conflict, have a tendency to more cooperative approaches to things, have a tendency to listen more? Yes. But those are the traits of the historically out-of-power groups. Historically non-dominant groups have a tendency to have those kinds of traits. And so it is a reflection of a person's position in their society and the power that they have in their society. So I just want to add that as a point in there. I do believe, and this is why I like the ripple effect, is that women do represent a mirror of society. They can represent that and the power of the mirror. I saw that when I interviewed the president of Iceland. President Vigdis of Iceland had been president for 16 years. She told me after she was in office about 8 years, she was going around Iceland and she was talking to the children. And one of the things she noticed was that for the children under 8, they all thought only a woman could be president of Iceland. And the boys had to ask if they could be president of Iceland because they had never seen a male president. So the ripple effect is there when you have that kind of thing. People will ask me, well, does it make a difference to have a woman as a leader? There I go to things like what has been happening, for example, in Norway. I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that Norway has a quota mandate, which 40% of boards of directors must be of the opposite gender. That's how the law reads. And if a corporate board doesn't get to 40% women on its corporate board, it's delisted from the Norwegian Stock Exchange and dissolved as a company. So what was interesting about before the law, they couldn't find any qualified women. It's amazing how quickly they found the qualified women after the law. And a quota system, an affirmative mechanism system, doesn't permit unqualified women. What it does is it removes in-group favoritism and closed social networks, basically old boys systems. So it provides for the opportunity for qualified women. And what they've discovered is that governance processes, now that there's a critical mass of O's in a room full of X's, that governance processes are changing on boards of directors. They've discovered, for example, that women read the board materials. What can I tell you? But what's interesting is now men are coming to the board having read the board materials. So what that tells you is that the dominant group's performance goes up in the face of the non-dominant group. The very presence of the non-dominant group changes the behavior of the dominant group. That's what that tells you. Second, they've identified that more of the board decisions are made within the boardroom, not nightclub, golf course, country club. So transparency levels in boards is going up. Third, they've identified that women will have a tendency to ask more questions. They're a little more risk adverse. Yeah. So they'll ask more probing questions, which incidentally makes the board meetings go longer with a little more conflict to them. That's what happens with heterogeneity. Fourth, they've identified that men will have a tendency to look at the short-term impact of board decisions. Women will have a tendency to look at the long-term impact of board decisions. Now, here's the thing about having men and women. The best boards look at both short-term and long-term. Well, that's the value of diversity. Yeah. Men will have a tendency to look at the shareholder impact of board decisions. Women will have a tendency to look at the stakeholder impact. Stakeholders, environment, employees, communities. Yeah. Best boards look at shareholder and stakeholder. So it's just a really interesting controlled experiment on what happens when you get a critical mass of O's in a room full of X's. I think that women have historically, the women that I saw have historically represented change. This was an interesting thing about our most recent election, in that the fact that Secretary Clinton comes from the historically underrepresented groups, so she represented change. But for many people, she represented a change that they didn't want. Because for many people, particularly in the dominant group, it reflected a loss of centrality, a loss of their own center of privilege. And so they didn't really want that change. On the other hand, she represented experience, which many people didn't want. So the fact of the matter was she got hit by trucks going in both directions, the change element of it and the experience element of it. But most women do come in, and often it's been said that women come in what's called the glass cliff. I have to call it the crumbling cliff, which is in a country in crisis, just as about when the cliff is about to crumble, they say, oh, well, let's try a woman now. And generally speaking, they're in the midst of conflict and crisis. They also say that, there is a glass ceiling for women. I actually don't believe there is. I just think it's a thick layer of men. You got to have a sense of humor about those things. Often they say that women lack confidence in their abilities. Actually, I think I'd like to flip that a bit and say that men are probably too confident in their abilities. That women are perhaps have a more reasoned approach to their confidence and things. That women avoid risk. Well, one could also articulate perhaps that men take on risk too much. One can look at these things from two different perspectives. I think that we have potentially lots of opportunities because one of the best parts of what's going on these days is that there's a lot more research going on about what's happening and what the impact of having women or not having women in decision-making is, what the impact on girls versus boys, on policies, etc. But I do worry a bit about all of this knowledge, because we have all of this knowledge. And I don't normally quote Donald Rumsfeld, our former Secretary of Defense. But he had a concept of the known knowns, etc. And one of the parts of that is the unknown knowns, which is we know it, but we act like we don't know it. That's what that is. So we have all of this research, but then we act as if we don't know what this research actually tells us. Just to close up now, because I know we'll have a further discussion on this, is that Tacitus said the worst crimes were dared by a few, willed by more, and tolerated by all. And the thing is that change actually goes through the same process. And women can be a vitally important part of that change. It's dared by a few who want to stand out there and have their voice heard. Then it's willed by more, the critical mass. And then it's accepted by all. And to me, that's one of the essential roles of having women in the public sphere to help create that change. Thank you.
Laura, thank you so much. There's a lot of food for thought there and hardly any reference to the events of last week, so that's really exciting for us. There's something really interesting there about women having to prove our leadership, something about perhaps the nature of the debate being extremely polarised, and the kind of boxes that we put one another into. And I think the most important thing that came out for me was this whole question about role models. Who are those ones that are daring to break that ceiling or to lead the way? And we see that whether it be in the development terms or academia and business, and obviously we've got some people here from business and from thinking to be able to kind of help us reflect on that. And I guess we want to spend the rest of our time, I'd like to think about, well, not so much what is different about women's leadership, but why is it so slow? Why is that glass ceiling so difficult to break? What are the obstacles that either people on this panel have come across, or what do we feel that we need to break more further to be able to progress and build a peaceful and sustainable world with women playing their full part in our opportunity? So I want to go to you first, Liv, if it might, as a woman in business, reflecting on any thoughts to reflect on what Laura was saying in there.
So I thought that was a genuinely fascinating speech. I thoroughly loved that, so thank you for it. Lots of stuff that inspired me and lots of stuff I could relate to. The bit I probably don't personally relate to is I've just been very, very lucky and seen the opposite of the glass ceiling. So I think generationally, maybe I arrived at the moment when there's been probably enthusiasm and energy to try and help support talent regardless of. And I've been probably terribly lucky with who I've worked for. So not many people make FTSE 100 at 37, so male or female, right? So I must have been incredibly blessed during the course of it. I'm clear on that. I think what's interesting
or
is...
just really good.
Yeah. Always very lucky. So and I'm very clear luck is probably a big part for my career. I kind of, the thoughts I had is, I think role modelling is really, really important, because I never thought that I would end up senior. So it never crossed my mind that I would end up this senior, and it wasn't an ambition. So I think the more that we can role model, and that's why I accept events like this, is the more that we can show people it's absolutely within their grasp to be able to have a couple of kids, still have a happy marriage, still see people, be a good mum, daughter, sister, aunt, and also have a career. So I think role modelling is an essential part of the future. On Severn Trent, it's interesting that talent always exists. So I believe there's endless female talent and diverse talent as well. And we are 60% female at the senior level and 45% senior at the board. So we are massively indexed. And yet, each person that I stole into my organisation ended up leaving a chasm behind where their previous organisation ended up with no women on the board as a result of them coming to join us. So have I created brand new talent? Yes, some, as in they gained promotions, but actually it's about driving more people to believe coming through the ranks. So I think the single biggest thing we can all do is to show belief in more people and to invest more time in helping the next generation and the generation after that and the generation after that to fast track them through. So I think it's on the cusp in the UK, I really do. I think it's just a belief and role modelling issue.
Thanks, Lynn.
There are many excellent points raised by Laura, who's a brilliant thinker and speaker. There are 2 points that I would like to highlight in particular. One is the stakeholder approach, and I strongly believe that us women look at things from a more holistic perspective, because we care not only about the immediate, career development and the immediate goals, but for the family, for the community, the society, and for the world as a whole. So success for us women is not just about ambition and ego, which is fair enough, but it is more about creating a better future for our families and humanity. That is one thing, and I believe that we need and we have the capacity and the ability as women to encourage more this triangular collaboration between civil society, the private sector, and the public sector. Now, the other thing relates to confidence. And lack of self-confidence is, I think, the biggest barrier for us women. Global Thinkers Forum launched last year a mentoring program. And our mentoring program pairs high-profile, very successful thought leaders and mentors who are committed towards ethics and positive change with young mentees and young women from all over the world. It is not only about their professional and career development. It is primarily about their psychological empowerment. Because if you have fear dominating whatever you have in mind to do, you will never take the first step to do it. So I'm not the one that believes in, glass ceilings and sticky floors. I come from a family that empowered me from a very young age. So gender inequality, that was never an issue. Gender equality and anything that I would wish to do as a woman, there would be no barrier for it. Perhaps not heavy weightlifting, but anything else. My parents raised me in a way that, I can do it. So it's a matter of determination, supporting each other as women. I personally encourage women to network and to learn from each other and to pay forward whatever we learn. And that's the way ahead, I think.
That's great, thank you. I think it's very valid for perhaps a Western society, but obviously around the world where there are absolute structural injustices that women face. Obviously not just women, but particularly people from ethnic minorities, where there's caste discrimination, and that kind of systemic poverty. Mentoring and building confidence is really, really important, but it's also important to challenge some of those structural questions and the causes of that kind of poverty as well. So I want to throw it out to...
Christine, let me add,
so, please, Laura, sorry, yes.
Number one, I agree with you very much. Some of the elements of structure the laws, or the enforcement of laws, or the policing of laws. I mean, many countries already have laws that have equality in the books, but they don't get enforced in any means. So you're absolutely right. And just to touch a little bit on the election, one of the challenges structurally for the United States is we have this winner-take-all system, which is very unfriendly to historically out-of-power groups. And we have this mixed up thing called the Electoral College, where you can win the popular vote and not win, kind of thing. Other systems, which is why, the United States is 93rd in ranking, in terms of political empowerment. Other countries have parliamentary systems. You have a lot more parties that have opposition leaders. Opposition leaders often become the leader of the country. We don't have that. The third parties don't get that. So you have some structural elements that do get in the way, and I can absolutely tell you that there are similar kinds of structural elements as you reflect upon, not just here. I think there are a couple of other things that are headwinds for women in getting advancement. One, mentoring is extremely important. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that having that notion of learning from others and saying, you're having that. Because often what happens is that when something happens to a woman and she does not have another woman to talk to about this, she will think it's pathological to her.
Absolutely, yes.
And she'll think, there must be something wrong with me, rather than understanding, boy, that's a social construct that's happening here, and I'm just part of that social construct. On the other hand, INSEAD, Herminia Ibarra at INSEAD has done some really interesting research and has found, at least in the corporate world, that women are over-mentored and under-sponsored. And those are two very different things. The sponsoring is, I'm going to support you as an individual, et cetera. So I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is that we kind of live in different worlds. When you read statistics on what men think about the progress of women and what women think about the progress of women, it's like they're living on different planets. I just did a speech in Australia where one of the statistics I used was that 92% of senior executive men thought women were making great progress in organizations. 92% agreed with that statement. 91% of senior executive women disagreed with that statement. So we're living in entirely different worlds when it comes to this kind of thing. So men see the progress, women see the challenges of it. And, Catalyst, I think one of them mentioned, found that men think that the number one reason women do not get ahead is because of child issues, child care issues. That is what they say is the number one issue. When they ask the women what the number one issue is, it's unconscious bias, it's not having positions of authority with power, it's not having mentoring and sponsoring, and then the fourth reason is child. So the men see it as the first reason, the women see it as the fourth reason. And so then you begin to say, okay, what are the policies of a company? If it's dominated by men, they'll focus on this, which actually aren't the levers that are going to create the change. So just a few more added comments on that.
Yes, I think so. And I think it's important to recognise that these different aspects are all playing into one another. So when I say structural issues are important, it's not to say that mentoring isn't, because it's about how do we engage at a number of different levels to bring it all in.
Absolutely. To play. And also I think that we need to take into account that there are different issues in different countries.
Yes.
So there are countries where women are, if you like, not able to progress or to follow their dreams and their vision because of cultural issues. There are other countries where they cannot do it because of lack of access to means, to technology, for instance. There are countries where the issues are around religion. And so it is very, very important to take all these different realities on board and adapt the approach accordingly, and of course locally adapt the policies accordingly, regulations or legal systems or public infrastructure. All these can be barriers for women. Above everything else, it is the cultural and the mental approach, because again I will highlight the point of determination. When someone is determined, when someone is a goal setter, there is nothing stopping us.
But you know what? I don't know whether that's quite true, right? Because I often think this is true. So remember two things that always strike me. is the day I got appointed to this job, there were more people called Ian in the FTSE 100 than there were women. I can't believe that...
It's John in the United States.
It's John in the United States.
Yeah.
And I can't believe that everybody's called Ian and John are the most determined people. And I also remember being briefed on something at the time I took the job, and someone saying to me, never get confused. The people who are the FTSE 100 are not the best 100 leaders in the country. They happen to be the 100 people who are in the right place at the right time to be appointed to be those people. I thought, totally agreed. So I'm not sure you ever do end up with the best talent at the top of a company, and I can say that openly, and I don't think you ever necessarily end up with the most determined people. So I think probably, it's like you said, somebody gets knocked back a little, but if there's somebody around them just to say, don't worry about it, that's normal, then that means they have more resilience. So resilience is probably the single biggest trait. If you could give women more resilience, they don't need more determination, and they don't need more intellect, and they probably don't even need that much more confidence, maybe. It's probably resilience. They don't allow themselves to be diminished by something, and they keep their belief.
And there are lots of factors, aren't there, that undermine that resilience, whether they be social, structural. I like your point, Laura, about gender constructs. We often talk about that. We've had to do quite a lot of work with people within Christian Aid and within our partners about understanding that when you're talking about gender, you're not just talking about this happens to be a woman. Gender rights are about what is the power imbalance between men and women, and it's about understanding it in those terms. That this is how we constructed your point about the Icelandic president. Brilliant example, and I think that's how we can open our minds. That's why, as role models ourselves, we can open our minds to others.
My background is in media, and I know that media and people in general like to place labels on other people, on groups of people. Makes things easier, right? But that's not the case. And when I joined Al Jazeera English as a journalist, and I moved to Qatar, and I had the opportunity to live in the Gulf for about a year and a half, I was astonished by the talent and the potential and the dynamic businesses run by women in the Arab world. And it is interesting because my friends and my colleague back in Europe, they were like, what are you talking about, Elizabeth? I mean, women in the Arab world run businesses, or they are CEOs, or, they are academics. And I'm like, of course they are. And I was outraged because of this image and the false reality projected by the media. And all of us tend to embrace things which are, unreal. So breaking stereotypes and denying cliches and giving voice to the voiceless, to voice their concerns and issues, I think is key.
Now, generally speaking, Credit Suisse, for example, has done some research around risk-taking in the financial sector and has found, for example, with hedge funds, that men will have a tendency to be, sort of risking at high levels and then end up risking, and then plummeting in their values. Where women's risk modulation is much narrower, the band. So it's one of those things where, do you want to strike it rich or, and or potentially be completely poor, or do you want to sleep at night, kind of thing. So there is some research that shows that men will have a tendency to have more risk, be more risk-loving, they call it, and women have a tendency to be more risk-modifying kind of thing. And, I think that research is valid research. The challenge is that the over-scrutiny comes when, if a man does a certain amount of risk and the woman does the exact same amount of risk, if, in fact, there's a double bind for the woman, that's where you start seeing this issue. Do people then criticize her because she wasn't doing enough risk? Do they criticize her because she was doing too much risk? So that's part of the challenge of this kind of thing, is that the women will have a tendency to be in a double bind, and that applies to all sorts of things. If she's liked, she's not thought of as competent. If she's competent, she's not liked. As we have seen very recently, you can be very unliked and still, as a male, and still be taking on the leadership roles. So this double bind thing is what gets in the way of giving you, in my mind, a straight answer to this risk profiling, because you've got this band in which you can walk before you fall into it. And that's one of the things about overconfidence. It's not that necessarily that I think women are less confident. But just think about it. If the words had come out of Senator Clinton's mouth, I know better than the generals, and I'm the only one who can solve these problems. Had she said that, people would have gone, whoa, you're a little too aggressive here. Your ego is way out of line, kind of thing. But we do know that in this case, the male said exactly those same things, and it was sort of, okay, well, a little bit bragging, but, whatever. So there's where I would qualify my answer back to you.
Thank you. Liv, you must...
I think it's probably different in politics than it is in corporate. So I think actually, and I think the three things that I think are different is the first thing is women tend to create team structures at the most senior level. And typically, male CEOs tend to create a much smaller subset of special advisors, of people that they turn to, so a subset of the senior team. And I guess that's one big change. So that means that I think you can take more risk if you've taken everybody's opinion into it and you've taken a much more balanced view. So I'm clear that I'm self-aware of where I'm good at stuff and where I'm not good at stuff, but I would take on big decisions of an M&A acquisition or a disposal or a new change in strategic direction or something big, then I would have a proper, good, open team debate, everybody's view on the table, and not leave the room until we've all collectively agreed something, which means I think you get a much more balanced risk profile. That's quite different to teams I've worked in where I've had a male chief exec, and instead they've taken one-to-one soundings and then made the final call. So I think you can end up where risk can be taken, bigger risk can be taken because the whole team's in it, which means the chance of success is bigger. I tend to find that in the UK, senior leaders, if things are going well, I think the opposite, I think they're over-talked up. So I sometimes think that when things are going well, the press quite likes to and to talk up a female chief exec because there aren't many offers, they want to. I think if things go wrong, I think because there aren't many offers, then it's over-publicised. So I think what you've got to do on that basis is none of the press is real. When the press is amazing about you, it's not real. When the press is awful about you, it's not real. So I think you've got to take that as being... You've got to just grow a second skin and say it's not real in any of those circumstances. So on decisions, I think women can take bigger risks based on their style of leadership. I think on press, we have to grow a stronger, thicker skin.
Thank you.
I believe in risk-taking, and I consider myself a risk-taker, but not for the sake of taking risks. I think we need to assess the situation, assess the possible failures and the possible disappointments that a risk could potentially bring. But at the same time, I don't think that fear of failure should stop us from doing things. I would highlight that again, it's a matter of the social culture that either encourages risk-taking, like is the case in the US, or kind of stigmatizes people who take risks and fail. And I think that it is extremely important to not be afraid of failure, because if you don't fail, you cannot try again, and you will not succeed, and you will not create big achievements. And the person that doesn't take risks, it means that they do not try enough. And at the end of the day, everything big, all big achievements, all big changes, transformation in societies or in political systems are escorted by someone who has been a risk taker. And that defines, I think, a good leader. Because as Laura said before, what is a leader? What is a good leader? Is it a person who is a charismatic speaker? Is it someone who dominates a room with their presence? Or is it the person that is not scared of taking decisions in critical times and taking risks when it is necessary to take risks? So yes, again, to risk-taking, but by assessing the situation and not being frightened of failure.
Thank you.
If you are the standout best person at your grade in a company, then I believe you will end up with a promotion, right? And if you are the stand-up best person in that company and it doesn't happen, you need to leave the next company where they will recognise it. But I think you've got to be really self-aware about, are you really the stand-out person in your company that grade? And I see 50-50, so I mentor and speak to lots of women, and half the time they are the stand-up person that grade, and something isn't happening for them that requires them to move to another company where they are going to get their moment. And sometimes they're not self-aware of things that maybe it's not a glass ceiling, it's a development area. So I think gathering lots of 360-degree feedback, really questioning, are you as good as everybody else, and working on those points. Goodness will come to you the minute that you're ready. I genuinely believe that. And if you honestly have taken all that feedback and somebody isn't prepared to take the risk, you need to go to a company where more and more companies want to take that risk, and you're not a risk. You are the person who is the stand-up performer, so it's your right. So I think it's about gathering the feedback until you're definitely ready, and the moment you're ready, it will happen.
Thank you. And I don't think we should necessarily see this as a polarising kind of like a win-lose thing, because actually this is about what in business it's about the solid business case in terms of, you know, for the if 50% of the world's population are being ignored or something, then that doesn't make any sense. It's not good business, not good politics, not good democracy, and it's not good for peace. Either, and it's that whole sense of how we as women be able to bring that kind of peace through our leadership. So a final kind of few thoughts and reflections to leave people with, particularly to think about perhaps for the next day or so.
I think it is very important to be aware of who we are, to know what we want to achieve, our goals in life, to know our strong points and our competitive advantage. And then be ready not to compromise and fight for what we want and speak up and claim the things that we are entitled to. These would be my final words. And if we can find a mentor in life who can help us with guidance, with support, with their values and their lights, then that is ideal.
Thank you so much. Laura?
Oh, all right.
I thought I'd just break the system. I'm just call me a rebel.
All right, very good. Look, I think first and foremost, we have to be at the table. Yeah, when it comes to peace agreements, when it comes to avoiding violence, eliminating it, we need to be at the table because, you know, women and men may have different sets of experiences, and we know that, you know, diverse opinions, diverse experiences are going to create the best solutions. So first and foremost, I think women just must be at the table and must be heard, you know, whether that's in business or in NGOs or in the political sphere. And then I agree with you, you know, to your point, we must work together. You know, the power of that critical mass, the power of it. A phrase I often say is that women are like snowflakes. One alone may melt, but together we can stop traffic.
That's a good one. Oh, Liv, follow that, sorry.
Two things I would say is, the most important thing is to be you. Sometimes women think they've got to create a persona, which is their work persona or their persona that someone's going to listen to. And actually the most important thing about you is that you are you in every facet of your life, because that's the voice that needs to be heard. And the second thing I'd say is, don't sweat the small stuff. So we do have a tendency sometimes where we get ourselves quite energised and we spend our moment when we're at the table on something that actually isn't the big stuff. Whereas I think in order to really be heard, in order to make sure that we're really happy that the contribution we've made is the best, is to make sure we focus on what is the big thing we wanted to land, and the small stuff is maybe it'll happen, but really focus ourselves on don't sweat the small stuff, focus on the big stuff.
Wow, thank you so much. And I think the one thing I'd want to add up is two things. One is that holding our hands out to one another as women. Sorry, boys. As women, we very often aren't that good for one another. We have to be out there and to support one another and not knock one another down. And recognise that we are. I'm including you in this one too, men. We are all in this together. We have to look out for one another together. And I loved your point, Laura, about the childcare issue and about how that's seen. It did kind of like reflect to me how we do operate very often in different worlds. But I was reminded of an old saying. I had it on a postcard attached with blue tack on my wardrobe for years. It left a terrible stain. But the postcard said, The hand that rocks the cradle also rocks the world. So I would like you to join me in thanking this amazing panel of real rocking women. Laura Liswood, Liv Garfield and Elizabeth Philippouli. Thank you all so much.